Resident Evil
is a survival horror game produced by the Japanese company Capcom, released on March 22, 1996 for the original PlayStation. It saw great success in both domestic and foreign markets, as well as among critics, selling over 2.75 million units and averaging a review rating of 91 out of 100 on Metacritic. After the game's success became apparent, Capcom leaned into the series, and in the following years released a slew of Resident Evil titles on a variety of consoles, with all of them achieving moderate to extreme success, both financially and critically. The first Resident Evil game was remade and re-released on March 22, 2002 for the Nintendo GameCube, receiving critical acclaim once more, with critics praising its updated graphics, immersive atmosphere, and cinematic elements. An HD remaster of the remake was released in January 2015 for Microsoft Windows, PlayStation 3 and 4, Xbox 360, and the Xbox One. The HD remaster brought with it beautiful renderings of the classic environments that pleased longtime fans of the series. Through all its releases, the setting has remained the fictional Arklay Mountains, on the outskirts of the fictional and generic Midwestern town called Raccoon City, always starring the members of the police department's Special Tactics and Rescue Services branch, or STARS for short. The game begins with the decision to play as one of two members of the STARS Alpha team, Chris Redfield, who is manly and generic, or Jill Valentine, who is female and slightly less generic. Each has their own unique path and gameplay differences. From there, the premise of Resident Evil is perhaps best explained through its opening cinematic.
Alpha Team is flying around the forest zone, situated in northwest Raccoon City, where we are searching for the helicopter of our compatriots, Bravo Team, who disappeared during the middle of their mission.
Haven't found it yet?
No, not yet, Brad. Bizarre murder cases have recently occurred in Raccoon City. There are outlandish reports of families being attacked by a group of about 10 people. Victims were apparently eaten. The Bravo Team was sent in to investigate, but we lost contact.
Look, Chris!
Bravo Team's helicopter was a derelict. Save for the remaining body of Kevin. We continued our search for the other members, and it turned into a nightmare.
Alpha Team is then attacked by a horde of ravenous undead dogs. One of them is killed, their pilot panics and takes off, and the remaining four run for their lives, taking refuge in a nearby mansion. Playing as Jill, you, Captain Albert Wesker, and Barry Burton make it to the mansion, with Chris going missing. Playing as Chris, you, Wesker, and Jill make it to the mansion, with Barry missing. Soon after, in both versions, you find the body of Bravo Team's Kenneth being eaten by a zombie, and you're quickly separated from the other remaining members of your team. From there, the nightmare begins, and you explore, solve puzzles to progress, fight off or avoid the undead, and search for your comrades while uncovering the secrets of the mansion. In 1996, Resident Evil defined the genre of survival horror with its emphasis on resource management, atmosphere, and player vulnerability. And the franchise it spawned went on to serve as one of the two major pillars of the horror genre for years to come. But by today's standards though, I wouldn't say that the original is very scary at all. In fact, I'd say it's laughable, with its dated graphics and notoriously bad voice acting.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
But the remake holds up today as a true masterpiece of gaming horror. I love the Resident Evil remake. It is a beautiful, cinematic, and immersive horror experience. And it also manages to be funny occasionally, albeit accidentally, with some of its voice acting still sounding like something out of a B-movie.
Jill and Barry together in hell.
But to fully understand the beauty of the Resident Evil remake, you need to understand the circumstances of its forefathers' creation. The story of the original Resident Evil's development begins back in 1993 at Capcom's Osaka development studio with Tokuro Fujiwara, who had directed several early Capcom titles like Ghosts and Goblins and Commando. Fujiwara sought to produce a new horror game based off an NES title he had directed in 1989 called Sweet Home, which itself was based off of a Japanese horror movie of the same name. Fujiwara assigned the role of director to game designer Shinji Mikami, who who had previously worked on Disney brand titles like Goof Troop for the NES, with this being his first time working in horror. Resident Evil's cinematic influences obviously begin with Sweet Home, which had a strong narrative lifted from its source material on the silver screen. Sweet Home made the player an active participant in that narrative though by having multiple endings, with each one resulting from how many of your friends you managed to keep alive. Resident Evil borrowed this concept with different endings resulting from how many STARS officers the player manages to save. The similarities go on as Sweet Home, the game, featured puzzle solving, cutscenes of doors opening, and rudimentary resource management, all of which are prominent elements of Resident Evil. Not to mention that both games take place in a giant mansion that gets destroyed at the end. However, Sweet Home featured more supernatural threats, including ghosts, wraiths, and evil dolls, while enemies in Resident Evil are all the product of science rather than magic. In an interview, Mikami discussed the decision to drop the supernatural aspects seen in Sweet Home, saying that he wanted the threats to be more concrete, so that he could create an atmosphere of constant fear, even for people who don't believe in ghosts. Mikami went on to say he wanted the atmosphere to be similar to that of Jaws, wherein the player experienced much fear because of a lurking threat, but was still capable of dealing with the danger. A quick aside here on the topic of Jaws being an influence. When I first read this, I remembered that several areas in the remake were cut from the original because of hardware limitations. One such area is the Aqua Ring, under the residence, which just so happens to have a giant shark. Mikami stated that in selecting the main enemy for the game, he quickly decided on zombies because of the deep impression that George Romero's Living Dead films made on him in high school. It's also been reported that the maze-like layout and style of the mansion was partly inspired by the Overlook Hotel in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. In my research, I actually discovered that almost every single enemy in the game was inspired by some horror movie, which made me love and appreciate this game a lot more as a sort of love letter to classic horror. But there's really too many to go into in depth with the time limit, so... Zombie dogs were inspired by Cujo and Pet Sematary. The swarms of crows were inspired by Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. The wasps were inspired by The Savage Bees and The Swarm. The snakes and Giant Snake were inspired by Rattlers and Tremors. The spiders were inspired by Arachnophobia and The Spider. Plant 42 was inspired by Little Shop of Horrors and The Day of the Triffids. The Hunters were inspired by Gremlins. The Chimera was inspired by the 1958 version of The Fly, and the Tyrant was inspired by the original Nosferatu and Future Kill. It might seem like all these cinematic influences are appropriate for a game that is framed like a movie with its third-person perspective, fixed camera angles, and detailed pre-rendered backgrounds, but this cinematic style wasn't the original vision for the game. Initially, Resident Evil was going to have full polygonal environments and a first-person perspective that Mikami hoped would create a very personal sense of fear, but as the game progressed, he and his team became restricted by hardware limitations. On this, Mikami stated, "It was an obstacle we could not overcome. If we had continued to try, there was a 90% chance the game would just never be completed." In resolving this issue, Mikami looked to Alone in the Dark, a series of horror games released on PC in the early 90s that utilized a third-person perspective with full polygonal characters on a pre-rendered background. Adopting Alone in the Dark's methods saved disk space and allowed for more polygons to be devoted to character and enemy models, resulting in greater realism and horror in both the environments and enemies. Faced with this massive alteration to the game, the development team was forced to throw out many features they had developed for the first-person version, and wound up having a lot of extra work to complete in order to implement this new design. They also needed to change the controls so that the player could maneuver through spaces with a constantly changing perspective. Hence the implementation of what is commonly referred to as tank controls. No matter what direction the character is facing on screen, pressing up moves the character forward, while turning requires the player press the side buttons to rotate. The controls were clunky and difficult to master, to say the least. When the game was in its testing phase, Mikami received a call from his boss at the time, Yoshiki Okamoto, who said, "Don't you dare put Capcom's name to shit like this. What the hell is wrong with these controls?" And in 1997, Mikami himself actually apologized for them, saying, "The only thing I disliked about Biohazard is the effort required by the player to maneuver the character. I sympathized with my audience, but I had no choice other than to wait for the players to grow accustomed to the controls. In fact, to this day, I have not found a way to rectify that. So once again, I apologize for the controls." Though in being forced to make this major change by hardware limitations, Mikami stumbled upon what would make Resident Evil a triumph of horror gaming, and the later remake a masterpiece. He discovered that through manipulation of the camera's angle and position, he could hide enemies and limit a player's awareness far more than the first-person perspective would have allowed. In almost any space in the game, the player is never fully aware of their surroundings. This creates suspense as the player enters new areas and makes it so that the player may not see enemies that are right in front of their character. As for the controls, yeah, it made movement difficult to new players and may even be annoying to an extent, but in a horror title, nothing would be more appropriate. The controls weaken the player. It puts you at an immediate disadvantage. Shooters and fighting games are generally easy to control, but in those games, you are meant to feel strong and powerful. But in Resident Evil, you are surviving a nightmare. The panic you feel when suddenly confronted by a zombie that you couldn't see in the last shot is only exacerbated as you mash at the controls trying to escape. I'd say that they even emulate a person's reaction in an actual scary situation, where you find yourself shocked and stumbling, slow to react. I found that I have a hard time being made afraid by most horror media, likely a symptom of analyzing and consuming a lot of it, so I hold the Resident Evil remake in quite high regard, as it was capable of not only scaring me, but in one particular instance, making me so afraid that I stopped playing entirely, and I cut the heads off of deer and collect their skulls.